Hey, NSYNC.
What's up, man?
How you going?
Good. How about you?
Yeah, really good actually. I'm excited for this chat now.
Yeah, me too.
um, so yeah, today we're going to talk a bit about synchronicity, cycles, and the self-healing nature of the psyche. I think this is quite a pertinent chat actually because the last few conversations we've had with various different guests have kind of naturally gravitated towards these conversations, and
Yeah.
I was thinking about like why is that the case? And I think partly that's because everyone that we've talked to and us, you and I, a lot of our guests, I think, actually, even if they haven't explicitly gone in that direction, are really interested in how to apply these metaphysical ideas that we're in touch with to healing and holding and being better as humans, but also moving towards a better humanity in general and trying to, model how we might do that. Um, yeah, and obviously you've been a part of, you have your own um, depth of knowledge and synchronicity, and it's a big part of your work. Um, yeah, I'm not sure where I want to start the conversation, but just wanted to
Yeah,
preface that. Yeah, it just feels like it's very alive for us. I
definitely.
mean,
Yeah, yeah. Well, what was I thought it would be cool to maybe talk a little bit about what you and Ari touched on when you were talking earlier, as a way of maybe introducing it, because I thought that contextualized. Because for me, like, I think it's important for people to understand synchronicity and how it works and all of that. But more important for me, I think, is for people to realize that it's not like some, I guess, like intellectual abstraction or something that only people who are interested in spirituality have experiences of or an interest in, but actually, anybody, because we're
mm,
all, wounded, we're all traumatized in one way or another, we all have things to work through, to work on. And synchronicity, I think, is part of the natural way that the psyche responds in situations where part of its coping strategy has been to hide something from itself, to refuse to
right,
acknowledge, to refuse to see, to choose not to know something. I think synchronicity is part of a feedback mechanism that reawakens us to something that we've chosen to forget at a time when we're ready to learn about it.
right, exactly. And I guess that's sort of starting at the end with the self-healing nature of the psyche, in some sense. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
the
Mhm.
conversation I was having, I was kind of remembering some of my studies in transpersonal counseling. I did it at Diploma. And we learned about Stanislav Grof, who was kind of one of the pioneers of, he pioneered breath work. So his holotropic breath work was a modality when basically the 60s and 70s of the LSD revolution, I guess it was. And then it became banned, it became illegal. And one of Stanislav Grof's intentions with holotropic breathwork was how do we invoke the same states as a psychedelic experience with our breath, with breathwork.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Um, Another one of his, I guess, reframings, I'd say, is on the experience of psychosis. So he kind of posited this idea that psychosis as a kind of spiritual emergency, which I also really like, as recognizing the oh, what's happening with the
I don't know.
deepened yourself. Hold up.
Oh, it's enough.
Distracted me there for a sec.
Sorry,
Um,
spiritual emergency.
yeah, spiritual emergency as opposed to psychosis, and recognizing the difference between a spiritual emergency and a psychosis as having these explicitly archetypal themes. And super interestingly, these themes that appear like throughout culture and seem to be a kind of inherent structure of the human psyche. Themes of good against evil, light against dark, and these sort of battles, these huge archetypal battles, and typical experiences of a psychosis are the sense of like the sort of ultimate paranoia, like there's some kind of fight going on between good and evil, and in the psychotic experience, there's this projection of that's happening through every moment. It's kind of like synchronicity becomes this paranoid sense. And I think it is pertinent in that sense to relate it to synchronicity.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the world is speaking to me in a synchronistic way, but my interpretation of it is all fear. It's all kind of, I can't handle this. And one of the frames I like for a psychotic experience actually comes from, I forget his name, but I recognize, I can picture the book in my head of what the cover looks like. But he talks about the fracturing of the ego and the kind of leaking through of this unconscious content in ways that, are not controllable. And that leaking through, I'm kind of relating to as a psychotic experience or the spiritual emergency. And the fear there and this sort of these archetypal themes are really interesting because, someone like Joseph Campbell tried to capture the hero's journey of these archetypal themes in storytelling and myth and ritual and culture. I think this is a really fertile ground of, finding the what might be core features of the human psyche and the kind of what we're talking about in terms of this natural healing tendency.
Yeah, definitely. No, you brought up and you touched on a huge number of really great sort of threads that I think would be excellent to unpack as we move our way through the discussion. One thing I did want to inquire a little bit more about, though, is I quite relate to this idea of psychosis as spiritual emergency. I mean, it reminds me of shamanism and the way that cultures with a shamanic tradition respond to someone who starts experiencing mental health symptoms when they're fairly young. They respond to it positively, basically as like this is a sign that you're chosen in a way to be someone special. And like, yeah, you're gonna have to go through something, but like at the other end of that there's this initiation into something, something better, which is so much. You can see how that would be a way more health producing response from the environment than something is seriously wrong with you, we have to put you in a box. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's the method of working with someone in going through psychosis or spiritual emergence. And I do want to caveat that there is such a thing as psychosis, and it's not all spiritual
Well, that's actually
emergence.
what I wanted to ask about, is because you mentioned recognizing the difference between a psychosis and a spiritual
So
emergency.
it is the archetypal themes that make that distinction the thing. So it's kind of like the way that you might recognize the difference is if it seems like the person going through the experience is being invited on that journey, so to speak. Like if these archetypal themes are present, and that these, as opposed to just like hearing a voice or seeing like there's hallucinations, those themes being present are what distinguish it from just psychosis.
And then if well, how would you understand or relate to those episodes of psychosis that can't be thought of as a spiritual emergency?
I'd imagine that they were similar in the structures being shattered and unconscious content coming through. Like, I don't think there's literally voices or people in the world that are whispering to them or anything like that. It's like it is still unconscious content of sorts coming through. But perhaps it's not coming through in a way that allows for a journey of healing with that particular unconscious content.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've showed you it before, but there's a great TED talk actually from a woman, Eleanor, I think her name is, who had schizophrenia. I can't quite remember what it's called. But it is about this theme of the self-healing nature of the psyche. And basically she tells a story about her diagnosis with schizophrenia. Well, so initially, she heard a voice, and it just made like neutral sounding observations about what she was doing. And she said that the trouble really began when she told someone about it, because they reacted in a way that convinced her that something was wrong.
Right.
And then she went to see a doctor, and the doctor, had a certain set of things he was looking for, and she kind of explains how she was an insecure kind of teenage girl, and when I started talking about the voice, he really perked up and paid attention to me. He really
Wow.
listened to me. You know what I mean? And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, there is something about that. And she kind of as the story goes on, she talks about how, you know, the descent into schizophrenia was actually precipitated by the kind of pathologizing attitude of psychology and psychiatry towards it, and
Yeah.
that in the end, it wasn't the meds or therapy or anything that helped her. It was actually opening herself up to what the voices had to say and recognizing that they were an unexpressed part of her trying to receive expression, you know.
Mm.
And then at the end of this journey, she's on a stage giving a TED talk, you know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah, really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so such a fascinating example there as well. Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to say as well, like that. Yeah, there's the importance with handling a client with psychosis is that normalizing their experience. Like you're not, there's no, well, I mean, yeah, there might be something wrong with you, but it's not a bad thing. It's not like,
Mm.
the rest of the world might react in unhelpful ways of freaking out or whatever, because it's such a, I don't know, mysterious topic of sorts, or like sort of the people in that state are designated to this sort of crazy house, or over there, like we don't talk about that, we don't think about that. But also the sense of like the I think this particular story sounds like an awesome example of not this happening, but there is a risk of the pathologizing nature of any kind of pathology put on someone can emphasize that their state, and I think this happens quite a lot in DID pathologies. Like if someone can be pathologized with DID, which can emphasize a state of DID. So it's like there's
Yeah.
a danger to it as well. But this sounds like a particularly healing experience as
Yeah,
opposed to
no,
dangerous.
well, I think the danger to it, I think, is evident in the initial part of the story, you know, where she kind of
Mm,
says that the descent was precipitated effectively by that attitude, and I definitely agree with the observation that you're making about. I think DID is a good example, although I think there are sometimes better examples. I think schizophrenia is maybe the best example because of the negativity, you know, surrounding that. But I also think there's part of that phenomenon is that when you can't tell what's going on, you know what I mean? Like you can't make sense of your experience yourself, you're struggling.
mm,
And then you have a guy or a woman, a doctor, who cares about you, who's investing in you, and they give you language to talk
mm.
about what's going on for you. Even if it's not right, it's better than nothing, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
And there's a way in which, because it helps you make sense to some degree of what's happening to you, you know, you start to think of yourself in that way. But that language, if it's not really accurate, can exacerbate the problem or distort the original problem in ways
right.
that make it more difficult to treat, I think.
Yeah, well, especially with a kind of more mainstream interpretation where it's just like, here's some drugs, and like, oh, we want to stop that. Like, let's make sure that we, deal with these symptoms in a way that doesn't really help the person, address the
Yeah.
problem, or be curious in that way that this woman, Eleanor, was it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I
Was.
think the most interesting thing I think about her story is that what it really illustrates is that even in spite of the pathologizing attitude of psychiatry in some situations like this, in spite of that, the self healing nature of the psyche triumphed over that.
Mm,
You
yeah,
know,
good
she
point.
ended
Yeah,
up
yeah,
listening to her inner intuitions
yeah,
and eventually trusting herself and working through those emotions and validating those parts of herself, and she's come out of the end of that much more whole.
yeah.
And so for me what that illustrates is that, you know, in a way it's almost like there are a few, apart from like catastrophic trauma that just totally shatters you, you know, there are a few things that can happen to a human being that they won't eventually heal themselves from if they're given the right resources and the right feedback.
Right. Yeah, we're very adaptable and robust in
Mm.
different ways.
Yeah, resilient, extremely
Resilient.
resilient creatures.
Yeah. And there's something as well, like I'm curious if there was what it was about this person, Eleanor, that allowed her to maintain that curiosity and in spite of
Yeah.
the different pieces of advice it sounded like she had something existing before that experience that maybe facilitated her healing through that experience that
No,
not
yeah,
everyone
that's the
maybe
thing.
has.
I think this is the thing I find so intriguing about it is, and I mean, you can listen to the story later on, maybe, and people who are listening to the podcast can obviously go and check it out when they have a chance. But from my sense of her telling of it, it's almost like there wasn't a thing. That's exactly what
Mm,
makes me attribute it to the psyche. You know what I mean? It's almost like the psyche just worked it out on its own when it was given enough time, basically. You know?
right. I guess what I mean is like that she might have had a proclivity for introspection already, or like a
Oh yeah, yeah,
some kind
possibly.
of tendency.
That didn't come through in the story though. That's all I can say.
That's fair
Yeah.
enough. Like I
But
imagine if she's self-reflective enough to have gone through that journey and reflect on it and tell people, then she must have at least some level of that.
yeah, I would be more inclined to think of that as a development rather than an initial state.
Yeah, fair enough.
But yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's the nature of the kind of hero's journey, right? Is there's this call to adventure, and then if you refuse the call, then that call becomes either you kind of get stuck in the normal world with a kind of something coming out sideways because it's unconscious and you're not dealing with it, or you just kind of get smacked over the head and like get on with this journey, mate. You gotta.
yeah, it's interesting. Actually, there's this thing in the Alchemist that I've thought about and puzzled over many times. At the beginning of the book, sorry, there might be a little bit of a spoiler, but anyway, so there's a baker, and the interaction with the baker is minimal. But basically, the shepherd boy has he meets an old man, and the old man tells him all about himself and knows about his dream. He had this dream about treasure buried at the pyramid, and he's talking a lot of like wise man shit, about like people's destinies and the greatest tragedy in the world is that people give up. Basically, is what he says, that people give up on following their dreams and they settle, and then I don't know. I'm not capturing it well, but he points as an example to the baker, and he says, this baker, he had this dream. I can't even remember what the dream was, but he decided not to follow his dream because I think it was actually to be a shepherd. Yeah, I think it was actually to be a shepherd. And then he's like, but bakers are more desirable for marriage than shepherds, so he decided to be a baker. And now he has money, and like in theory he could, what I mean, indulge that dream, but it's like now he's attached to what he's got. And the same thing repeats later on in the story with the crystal merchant who has this dream of going to Mecca. He's a very religious man, and it's strange. I don't understand it. That's part of the reason I puzzle over it. But the old man basically says, like, he ends up, the boy ends up like working at the crystal merchant store for a while and making quite a bit of money for him, and so he ends up in a position where he could go to Mecca, and the boy like sort of says, you can go, and the old man is like, yeah, but I'm not going to because I'm scared that it won't be as good as my imaginings or something like that.
Mm,
And it's like there's this strange thing where it's like on the one hand, I'm inclined to think that when you get caught in a cycle, you know what I mean, and you get stuck, that it keeps repeating until you
mm.
grow. But then I look around, and it's obvious to me that there are adults. Like there's a point, people make a choice at a certain point in their life to stop growing, to just, you know what I mean, and
Kind of put up with the fact that they're in this position that's not very comfortable, but it's kind of like, oh, they'll do.
yeah. But the thing I struggle to make sense of is like, how do you resign? I don't understand how you resign yourself to that, because my thought is surely it keeps returning and reminding you of what you're supposed to be doing. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, but you might be in a position where you're just comfortable in a bunch of different ways. You've got your needs met, where the thing that is that pressure of like, hey, listen, you're doing something.
yeah, no, I think you're right. That does seem, because I was thinking as I was speaking, there's actually the same thing gets echoed again later in the book. The boy interprets a prophecy at the oasis, and he ends up saving saving them from something really unexpected.
Mm.
And so they appoint him counselor of the Oasis. And at this point, the boys met the alchemist, and the alchemist kind of says to him, if you stay as counselor of the Oasis, you know, you'll get rich and people will love you, and you know what I mean. And but after a few years, the omens will start to speak insistently of your journey, your destiny, and if you ignore them, this is the thing that is said in the book that I don't quite understand, because I can't imagine it being true, but it's said to be true, so it's puzzling. But if you ignore them, they go away, is what it says. If you ignore them,
Mm.
then they abandon you. And so then the alchemist says you'll be dismissed from your position as the counselor, because they'll see that you don't have the way anymore. You can't see anymore. You know what I
Mm.
mean? But it won't matter
Yeah,
because you'll
that's
be rich and, you'll be
yeah,
popular. And
yeah. That kind of speaks to the not very well named stage in the hero's journey, the woman as temptress, the kind of moment of being distracted by material things and pleasure and safety and sort of taken off the path. And people can stay there for years, like in the Odyssey, Odysseus meets Circe and his, crew get turned into pigs and he just like lazes around and eats
yeah.
fruit for years or something like that. I can't remember how
Well,
many
there's
years it is,
actually a
but
woman involved in the alchemist thing as well. He meets
right.
he meets the woman that he wants to marry. Fatima is her name. And there's some great stuff about that as well, where the alchemist says something like, if what you found was pure light, then it will be here when you return, you know.
Mm,
But if what you found was just like a flash, you know what I mean, just a flash of illumination, then it wouldn't. Then even if you stayed, you couldn't get it. You couldn't get it
mm,
back,
interesting.
which is really, yeah, really interesting. Um,
Yeah, it kind of, I mean, people, I mean, going back a bit, people talk about
yeah,
in relationships, like there's, I don't know, a common adage of like for women who date a bunch of men and like, oh, why do I always choose the bad boy? Or like, why do I always, go for this type of person? And, I think men also do that, but don't talk about it as much, maybe, typically. And there's a sense that like all of our upbringing molds us in a particular way, and there's some safety in that. We've created all these safety mechanisms and comforts, and attachment styles are based on whatever we didn't and did get met at a young age, and we
yeah,
can keep playing those things out because that feels like the way that we know things. And there's a sort of a more mundane version of that glimpse of light, as you put it in The Alchemist, of just like, oh, what am I actually doing? Like, maybe that's the first step of the first glimpse of light, is like, maybe there's something wrong, like recognizing that might be something wrong is the first step to change, probably one of them,
yeah.
after repeated being battered over the head and not recognizing that.
Well, yeah, I think partly this is where I think synchronicity really comes into it. So I love that you brought up the example of relationships, because relationships, I think, is one of the areas where synchronicity is most operative.
Mm,
Um, and so like people do get into these situations where like they say they pick a bad partner, a similar bad partner again and again,
mm,
and I think the reason for that is that when we have negative experiences in life, there's a lesson in them. That's let's say an adaptive way of looking at it. You know what I mean? Like something about our choices, our way of relating to the world, like led us to be in a situation where we had that bad experience. Usually there's something that we could learn from that. And so the way I would frame that is there's a way in which we all end up playing a role in the creation of even the worst experiences that we have. There's some responsibility we have in being there to begin with. And I think part of, this is what I mean is, so how does someone go from a bad relationship to a bad relationship? The way that happens is that they don't realize why they were in the first one,
mm,
essentially, right? So they don't realize, okay, why did I initially seek you out? What do I need to learn about me from this choice that I've made, that I've now learned was the wrong choice? Why did I think it was right? What was wrong with it? You know what I mean? What's
yeah.
wrong with me for having thought that? And how do I change that? You know what I mean?
There's some tricky semantics in here, like if it's an unconscious thing, is it really a choice or whatever? But if we're
I
not
think
going.
initially with all the patterns that we get sealed into, initially it is always a choice. Initially, it's something consciously that we.
But like in terms of being a child and being born and then having particular attachment styles embedded in our family systems, like that doesn't feel like a choice in any sense of the word.
No. That's not a choice. But what I'm saying is that when we seek out a romantic partner to replicate an experience that we've had in our family, and to try to resolve that, right, which is a normal thing I think for humans to do, to try to recreate a situation where something didn't work, to try to figure out why it didn't work, and you know what I mean. Now,
It doesn't seem like a conscious thing for most people,
no.
right?
Initially, it's not. The first time, you could say it's not. But
Yeah.
every time after that you fail to learn the lesson, you opt in more and more, right? Because it's like
Mm.
you could take a step back and say, okay, I'm going to try and really learn from this experience. Or you could just move the fuck on and jump into the next relationship. That is what in reality most people do. And so because they do that, they don't end up, they make that choice not to say, okay, my relationship has just imploded. I need to reflect on what this means about me, you know?
Yeah. It's a tricky thing, right? Like, what is the circumstances in one's life that allow for them to reflect on such a thing? Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a simple example we could look at. Like if
Good example,
the
yeah.
the self-actualization tendency doesn't even come online until you've got all this other stuff online. I mean,
True.
saying that, part of the pyramid is there's a relational piece in there, social relational piece in there. So there's some, I don't think it's as linear as that. I think that there's some self-actualizing tendency happening all the time, like we're talking about with synchronicity, like it's always in the background. But there's a kind of awareness of that, and then a conscious decision to choose to try and do something different or to learn and grow feels like a rarer thing in a world where we're forced to deal with the lowest rungs of that pyramid for most of us, right? Like we're looking for safety, we've got to
I
make
don't
the
know.
money.
I'm
And
not so convinced about that, no. I mean, at least maybe I'm just really, really privileged. But I'm just average in that respect. Like most Australians are like me in being privileged in this sort of way,
mm-hmm.
having access to great unemployment, being able to go attend university, get HECS, and also
Yeah,
the government will pay you to attend university, and public schooling is free
yeah.
and healthcare is
So what
free.
is it about, like considering all of that, what is it about Australia, let's say, and the way that people are brought up in Australia that doesn't initiate them
Great
into that
question.
mindset?
Great question. Yeah. I think part of it is that we have an anti-intellectual culture. I think is a reaction formation against our inheritance ancestry in Britain. I
Mm.
think that's part of the origin. I think of our reverse politeness culture as well. You know, I mean, obviously, we're people who are put in a box and then sent on a ship over to, that's the origins of this country. So
Mm.
there's a general anti-British sentiment that I think has become normalized, and just rather than being something about Britain anymore, it's just a national identity. We just are different, right? Like a child
Yeah.
differentiates themselves from their parents by taking on attitudes and beliefs that are very contrary. That's how I would think about it.
Yeah. Because I would say that maybe there's a similar issue in England, for example. Like I grew up in England, and we have a kind of safety nets in terms of dole money and health insurance and health care systems and whatnot. So yeah, I still feel like there's like a hidden
Yeah. So
borrowing
why
to do.
is it that people don't? I mean, okay, so part of it is, I think, capitalism. Capitalism totally
Hmm.
monopolizes people's time.
Yep,
You know,
and that's what I meant by the bottom rungs of the pyramid. It's kind of like this.
sure, I guess so. Yeah, yeah. I guess what I'm saying though is that if you are willing to, say, in some countries, if you're willing to be face the social reprisal, there are ways of getting by that don't require you to sacrifice all of your time. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, well, that's another thing that's instilled in us, right? Is there's that work ethic, and that's a capitalist thing in itself, right? In order to be
yeah.
valuable, you have to work hard and earn money and blah blah
Well,
blah.
yeah. And this is why I say I think capitalism monopolizes time, because what I think is that if people had all their time free, they would
Mm.
naturally want to be of service. They would naturally be productive.
Yeah, I
Most of
agree.
them, I think. Some of them would just coast, but those
Well,
people,
there'd be a reaction to the pressures of capitalism initially, I think, which is why
Mhm.
people think, oh, well, if we didn't have work, everyone would just be lazy. Because, like,
Yeah,
well, yeah, what first thing I'd want to do is take a holiday. Like,
exactly,
I want to
exactly.
relax and chill the fuck out,
Yeah,
and
but
then
as
I'd
someone
be
who
creative.
has spent most of my adult life not working, I can tell you that at a certain point you want something to do. You know, you
Yeah,
want a way to be
yeah, yeah.
useful to people.
I mean, I had that
So
exact same experience traveling. Like, I was working most of my young adult life, and then I was
mhm,
like, "Fuck this!" I left my partner and my house and my car and whatnot and my job, and just went traveling in India and Asia for 2 years. And at some point in that trip, I was like, "No, I want to do something. Like, I don't want to just be a nomad. I want to actually contribute." And
exactly.
part of that is like helping people. Like, if I can, I can help myself, but I also want to help others, and it doesn't feel satisfying just to be completely helping myself. So, yeah, I feel that that's a natural tendency at some point with enough free time and space.
Yeah, 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 definitely. I think the thing is that when people are given the freedom to explore a path as much as they want to, often I think you see this in the story of the Buddha. Like the story of the Buddha is that he was a prince, and so he was raised basically having access to all sorts of luxuries and stuff.
Mm,
And obviously, there's a story about his initial encounter with mortality and stuff like that. But I'm focusing more on his story of trying the different ways of life. So having tried, like the material life and having grown dissatisfied with it, then he tried sort of fasting, and
mm.
almost killed himself
Becoming an
fasting.
ascetic.
Yeah, and decided that actually that wasn't the way either. And there's something about that that I think makes sense. Like if you give people the room to
Mm,
try something out as much as they like, oftentimes they decide that maybe it's not the way, and they come back to something that's more productive. And so, like the Buddha had the freedom to, being a prince, having access to quite a bit of resources. He had the freedom to kind of just do whatever he liked, and that's what he did. And then he ended up creating Buddhism. Like that's a pretty, you know what I mean? That's
yeah.
and I think a lot of rich people don't use their leisure productively, say. But I think that's the thing is that historically the rich have been a minority, and we are in a unique spot historically today where collectively we have access to an amount of material wealth that, if it were distributed properly, would make us all richer than any king has ever been.
Mm, mm. Yeah. And there's, yeah, maybe the fear of losing our purpose and meaning in that we've been getting from capitalism in our lives as wage
Yeah,
slaves essentially would is stopping us from leaning into that, like the especially today, right? Like we're at a
yeah.
time where this wealth inequality is huge, bigger than it's been throughout history. So yeah, what is it that's stopping people from? I don't. Maybe this is getting off topic. We were talking about revolutions now, and we were talking about the requirements of
No, I think
revolution at one
it's
point. That's fun.
we can circle back once, but this is a good thread. I like it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it makes me think of times like COVID. Like during COVID, people were put in lockdown, right? And like they lost their access to their usual routines and work. And if you had kids and you're home trying to work remotely with your kids and whatever, there's a huge disruption to the normal way of life. And the interesting thing that got emphasized during COVID, I think that sprung up during COVID, is conspiracy theories, like the attention to this sort of I think it's a natural thing in some sense, like a natural paranoia and distrust and dissatisfaction, especially when it's like, wait a minute, my purpose and meaning that I usually, and like my break from my kids or family or my life is being taken away. It's easy to try and blame, the government if that's the people putting the lockdowns in or whatever. Um, and then the vaccines is kind of enforced thing that, let's not get into a vaccine debate now, but yeah, I think it's interesting that during a time when people have the opportunity to reflect and kind of not be distracted as much by work because they were forced to be at home. Um, that what came out of it feels like messy paranoia or something like
Well,
that.
actually, I think that's that seems to me what I would expect, I guess. So first of all, I want to say like that seems to me like the kind of like the problem with the very vocal minority. So
Mm,
conspiracy people who are working on themselves, they don't have a whole lot to say, but people who are like, "Oh my god, the world is rotten." They're generally screaming it from the rooftops.
mm. Because it feels so pertinent to them that they're like, I have to tell people, like, I need people to know this because
Yeah,
it's
well,
so true for me.
it's not just that it seems true for them. They're not distinguishing between this is something that's true for me and this is something true for everyone that's really important. I think that's what's really going on in the inner work is you're easily able to make that distinction and say this is
Mm-hmm.
me, this is my work, this is not something other people would necessarily care about or want to be lectured about or anything like that. Fuck
Yeah,
off.
I don't want to go into a conversation about judgments around too many judgments around people who have taken on a conspiratorial mindset because there are
Well,
true
yeah, no.
conspiracies
I
and
think
there's
what I was gonna say is, I think that conspiracy theory, the upsurge in that time, is actually evidence of an increase in reflective thinking.
mm,
And I think part of that is that there's often a grain of truth in conspiracy theories,
yeah, exactly.
and lots of conspiracy theories in the past have turned out to be actually about the government specifically, about things that the government may be up to, have turned out to actually be accurate, which I think legitimizes that practice a lot.
Yeah.
However, I will say conspiratorial thinking is almost synonymous with sloppy thinking for a reason.
Mm,
And I think part of the problem with, say, a whole huge swarm of people suddenly having the time to reflect is um, it's sudden. They haven't gradually eased into it. They don't have skills. They haven't spent time
yeah, yeah.
developing skills.
Yes, there's a was it apathenia is
Hmm.
the putting together of seeming disparate contents
Yeah,
and trying to make sense of it all, which I
yeah,
think is again it's a skill, right? Like I think that's a really important skill to do,
yeah.
but to do it skillfully is not to just like smash it all together and be like, oh, the aliens on the moon or whatever. It's
Yeah, I think part of the thing is that critical thinking is not that common a skill, and
mm,
that if you're going to be thinking critically about other people's narratives, which is that's what's going on in reflective thinking about external world politics and stuff like that, you need to be capable of thinking critically about
mm,
your ways of relating to that and making sense of that. Because if you're not able to do that, you start building a giant castle,
yeah,
of ideas about the world that nobody can correct you on because you're not receptive to that type of dialogue.
yeah. It's actually, I'm coming stepping back a bit. I'm just remembering how I think that my own self-reflective capacity started coming online more and more as a child. Is when I discovered a book on my dad's bookshelf. It was Helen Palmer's Enneagram, and it talked a little bit about the origins of Enneagram from Gurdjieff and the different. I don't know if for anyone who doesn't know what the Enneagram is, it's kind of a typing system similar to Myers Briggs, but within its own system.
Yeah, it's spelled ENNEAGRAM, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And it's got these 9 different types. And I opened the book and started reading it, and I got to type 9, and I was reading it. And I was like, "Wait a minute, this person's just describing my childhood and my, habits and stuff." And I was like, "Holy shit!" It feels a little bit like astrology or something in that way, where it's like, "Oh, this is so general that it could apply to anyone." And I guess that's the nature of types. Is like, well, if there's only 9 and there's 8 billion humans, then it's going to be able to apply to blah blah blah. But
Yeah,
there's a sense of like for me, it was more of a sense of I can step back and witness the things that I'm doing, and someone else has already done that and written that down, and
yeah,
now I can learn. Oh, this isn't helping me. This isn't helping me. This is how I can
exactly.
overcome this. This is how I can overcome this. So that was the beginning of my self-reflective capacity. Was a kind of, I guess it's like a taking a new perspective, right? It's like stepping out of
Yeah,
myself and saying, "Hey,
exactly.
this is me," and this critically assessing it. It's like, do I like this thing that is me?
Exactly. No, I think that's
So
really
what is it that? I mean, it's kind of like a mirror, right? Like people look in the mirror all the time, but
yeah.
then do they
No, I
actually
think exactly.
critically look?
Exactly. And I think the funny thing is that modern humans in a way are like one of the most arrogant forms of humans that have ever lived. Like it's like they have the best justification ever for being arrogant. So it doesn't look like arrogance,
Mm.
but it really is, because like I think the mirror thing you said is great. You know, it is like a mirror. Human beings figured long ago that having someone like look at you and describe you to you, you know, that's one of the best ways of seeing yourself.
Mm.
And so, you know, something like astrology or a typing system, I think especially astrology, the tarot, I think of these as like human beings are clever creatures. We found a way
Mm.
of storing that information. You know what I mean? And
Yeah. Oh,
part of it, it's like a huge bunch of descriptions that have been encoded into these types. And yeah, the type,
mm.
it's like there's a way in which obviously types are too general. Like you said, there's like how many types versus 7 billion, you know what I mean? And
Mm.
but there's a real valid critique there in terms of obviously a typing system is a reductive kind of narrowing down kind of, sure. But the point though is to help us to achieve those moments of like, okay, someone in the past experienced a certain psychological dynamic, okay, and so they have described it for us. The terms that they've used are, say, okay, the Gemini does this, and then you know the Aries does this, and you know what I mean. But the point is that that dynamic that's being described actually plays out in real life, and you can see that
Yeah.
and learn from the description of that how to respond if you encounter it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a sense for me that in trying to create a typing system, you're almost pointing to the structure of the psyche. You're trying to point to the structure of the psyche in a very generic way, right? You're trying to be like,
Yes.
all humans have inherited some particular apparatus, and they start with this particular apparatus, and that apparatus, because of its makeup, can develop in these particular ways. And somehow we've managed to figure out that there's specifically 9 of these, or 12 of these, or 16, or whatever of these things. And I still think there's like heaps and heaps of value in a typing system for that
Yeah.
reason, like I said. And there's a
Yeah.
great moment in a movie. I forgot what it's called, but it was the first rotoscoped movie. Damn, I wish.
Rotoscoped?
Yeah, where each frame of the movie is drawn over the top, so it kind of looks like an animated drawing, or it might
Okay.
be in the second. Um, damn, just gonna kick myself not remembering the name of that. But the quote is you haven't met yourself yet, but in meeting others, you'll learn about yourself, or something like that.
Yes, yes, yes. I
Um,
love that. I'm very big on the notion that people don't really know themselves except through relationship with the other. That is the chief. That's one of the reasons I think synchronicity is most operative in relationships, is because relationships are a unique opportunity to dynamically, like to kind of dynamically disrupt the distortions that you always producing when you
mm,
project about who you are, by listening as well and comparing and kind of trying to find, okay, what's the signal in this noise, you know, can
mm,
we triangulate something about me that I
yeah.
know that you're also saying. That's one of the reasons there's a metaphor I really like for, you know, and there are some problems with the metaphor because it's a bit violent, but I really like it for receiving criticism, which is like, it's a hard thing to do because basically someone's throwing knives at you and you have to like help, you have to like guide them in with your voice.
Mm,
And when you do that successfully, bang, they hit you with the knife and it fucking hurts because they got you.
mm,
And so, you know, part of criticism, I think, is when people have something to say about you, they don't like something about you. Oftentimes, they don't know exactly what it is. You know, they've got a general sense of it.
mm,
And so they'll tell it to you, and you'll be like, well, that's not true. Right. But the thing is to try to work with them to understand what they're experiencing, and then work your way backwards to something that you know you do,
mm,
you know what I mean? To try and find that meeting point and see how it's affecting someone else. And when you get there, ow, that hurts because now I see this is my fault. And
yeah.
damn, you know, what else is my fault?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, there's so much. I feel like I kind of want to go back because there's so many
Yeah,
different
no, let's go
points
back.
to
Yeah,
touch on here. But there's something about the mirror as well, and like kind of the myth of Narcissus is like a
yeah,
classic thing. And the kind of, oh, you're a narcissist if you love yourself and you look at yourself and you're like proud of yourself. And even in Australia and England, the sense of like tall poppy syndrome is like, no, you shouldn't be, you know, big and proud and you know, happy with yourself in any way. You should always be. And I think that's, you know, it's obviously a failure if you do just become a full-on narcissist. Like there is such a thing as narcissism, and
yeah, definitely.
it's a problem. But there is also, you know, a big growing movement in terms of like self-love and kind of just accepting
Yes,
yourself for who you are. But that's balanced with the acknowledgement of, you know, that you're also becoming something better. It's kind of like, yeah, I need to accept myself for who I am in this moment and be proud of everything that I've achieved, acknowledging that there's still a long journey ahead of me, that there's lots more to do and to grow and to offer. And yeah, the myth of Narcissus has a risk of, you know, stopping people from moving towards that self-love attitude, because it does seem so isolated. It's kind of like, yeah, you're only loving yourself or you're only thinking about yourself. And that doesn't have to be the case, right? Like you can think about others more than yourself, but still feel good about yourself and still feel
definitely.
proud of yourself and still
Yeah,
even like hold yourself high in some way.
yeah. No, I think there's something really profound in there about self-absorption. I think
Mm,
in that I don't know. It's almost like my sense is it's almost like people always they spend their whole lives self-absorbed, and you know, in most of their interactions with other people, that what they see is their own imaginings. You know, they very rarely see the
mm.
other person.
Just
You know
making
what I
up
mean?
stories about everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And so the self-absorption, you know, that's almost like being asleep in a way, you know.
Yeah.
And
That's a quite pertinent frame.
yeah, well, I guess waking up, that the notion of waking up and self-remembering, remembering yourself, and reminds me again of the stepping back and witnessing yourself.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And that in itself reminds me of the glimmer of self-awareness or self-consciousness, which, you know, you were talking about before. You know, you can that gives you an opportunity to make a judgment. You know, to decide, do I
Mm.
like this thing that I see that I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, mhm.
There's even a risk in the self-absorption in the process that you described earlier, where it's like rather than being, oh, how am I involved in this? Always being, this is just your projection, or this is just you, you know, being triggered by something I am, but it's actually your fault. I don't have to think about it at all because
Yes.
it's all you. Like that's a self-absorbed version of what you described before.
Hmm. Yeah, well, it's interesting because, yeah, it's self-absorption is one of those things that, you know, has different layers. You know, like
Mm.
there's a way in which that's self-absorbed. Um,
There's a way in which it's true as well, right? Like it always takes two to tango. So there's a truth in that, but it's also not acknowledging your part in
well,
that tango.
it's the thing that strikes me is that it's self-absorbed to the degree of not acknowledging that you are self-absorbed as well. So
Mm-hmm.
that there is something about this that is because of your way of injecting your way of being into, and kind of insisting on that because you just make the assumption that that's just how things should be. You know what I mean?
Right. And in that case where the judgment from the other person is you're self absorbed, then
Mhm.
that's going to be a hard one to
Yeah,
come out
that's
of.
true. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But interestingly, I mean, I don't want to get off track, but I would love to. You know, you mentioned Narcissus and the reflection and stuff, and I was talking before about The Alchemist, and for me, The Alchemist is like by Paulo Coelho, by the way, because there
Mm.
is actually another book, great book, spelled with a Y instead, about Nicholas Flamel, but that's a fiction book. Or well, they're both fiction books, but rather that's like a fantasy book, whereas
Yeah. It's like spiritual fiction genre,
well, it's actually called visionary fiction,
visionary
the
fiction.
type
Yeah.
of fiction that The Alchemist is.
So my introduction to visionary fiction was through Richard Bach and Jonathan Livingston
Yes,
Seagull and
it's a
the
fantastic story.
um, what was the illusionist? What's it called? Whatever his second book was. Damn, my brain
I
today
actually haven't read
for book
anything else
names.
by him.
Yeah, it's cool. It's yeah. I think, you know, these kind of things I think are hard to recommend. Kind of like if a song changed my life, recommending it to someone else isn't going to have the same effect. Like, it was where I was at the time when I
Yeah,
read it,
yeah,
it
yeah.
had a profound effect on me. But yeah, I like, as an adult, if I read Illusions, that's what Illusions, something about a reluctant messiah.
Mm-hmm.
If I read it today, I'd probably still enjoy it because it has that nostalgic and
Sure,
kind of
yeah.
transformative quality to it. But it also might not hit me in the same way if it wasn't the case. And I feel there's I'm a bit ignorant to this even, but I feel that there is a little bit of a small pool of visionary fiction,
Oh,
relatively.
yeah, there is,
Yeah, I can
yeah.
think of a handful of like Herman Hesse maybe, and yeah, I don't even know.
Yeah, no,
I'm
yeah. It's
not sure.
definitely a tiny, tiny pool of books in that genre.
Hmm.
Um, but there's actually, I think, The Alchemist is really good in that respect, in being like one of the things I think that's made it so famous is that it's simultaneously about the author's own hero's journey, because for him, his treasure is writing, and he openly talks
Mm.
about this in some interviews and stuff. Um, but at the same time, he's managed to, because his treasure is writing, he's managed to make it into an allegory general enough for anyone, general enough
Mm.
to kind of, like, all of the
Yeah,
symbols he's
resonate.
chosen are archetypal enough that there's not enough of a mismatch to cause you to go, this ain't me. It's more like it
Yeah.
causes you to ask, is this me? Could this be me? Like a
Mm.
wondering, which I really love. I think that's a wonderful quality of the story, the way that it kind of opens you up and makes you wonder about the what like, yeah, see, because the crazy thing about it, I think, is it's like a child's story, and it's written about a child, but it brings out the child in the reader. As
Mm.
you're reading, you're like, wow, there's something full about this perspective, this vision of the world I'm being given.
Yeah,
Really cool.
and it makes me wonder about, because talking about the kind of archetypal themes and the sort of uh, initiation of sorts, like into adventure or kind of trying on
Yeah.
the story for yourself. And I feel like myth in various cultures had that same intention to a certain degree, right? Like the
Yes.
different stories that were told around the fire and in different tribal groups and throughout history, I think, which is why it's so easy to find the hero's journey within culture, because all of them seem to be trying to speak to the new generation to a certain extent in that way, and maybe even initiates us into that imaginative domain of self-reflection, trying it on, kind of witnessing someone else's journey as ourselves. There are even some video games, like I remember the Legend of Zelda kind of first playing Ocarina of Time. It's like a Nintendo 64 game, and the character is silent, so they don't say anything. So it's quite easy to kind of put yourself in their shoes, and
Hmm.
they go on a kind of hero's journey as well. And I think that there's just the way that we can put on another person's perspective. I mean, it happens in movie. That happens in all kinds of media, right? Like to put ourselves out the way and to try on someone else's perspective. That is part of the healing. That is part of the natural healing tendency of the psyche. To be in community, like we're community beings, and we are teaching each other all the time. If only we are open to that, I
Yeah.
think.
No, definitely, and I think that's a great lens for relating to myths and stories. And actually, there's a unique version of the myth of Narcissus included as a prologue to the 25th anniversary edition of the Alchemist,
Hmm.
which is really beautiful. And not only is it beautiful, but it echoes themes that become important later in the book that were really pivotal for me. Like, so, the Alchemist, I think, is really interesting because it's so general a text. But for me personally, it's like one of like the central books of my life. I would say,
Mm.
like, it's really impactful for me, and that's to do with this sequence around the boy turning himself into the wind. But there's the way that uh, Paulo Coelho imagines the boy achieving that, basically relies on this thing that is encapsulated in this sort of very short prologue at the beginning. This myth of Narcissus. I'd love to read it if that would be okay.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Unfortunately, my face will be in darkness because I have to swap apps. But
have you got it there, or do you need to do a little search for it?
I have it here. Here we go. The Alchemist. Oh wait, I'll swap screens so I can look at the camera. The Alchemist picked up a book that someone in the caravan had brought. Leafing through the pages, he found a story about Narcissus. The Alchemist knew the legend of Narcissus, a youth who knelt daily beside a lake to contemplate his own beauty. He was so fascinated by himself that, one morning, he fell into the lake and drowned. At the spot where he fell, a flower was born, which was called the Narcissus. But this was not how the author of the book ended the story. He said that when Narcissus died, the goddesses of the forest appeared and found the lake, which had been freshwater, transformed into a lake of salty tears. "Why do you weep?" the goddesses asked. "I weep for Narcissus," the lake replied. "Ah, it is no surprise that you weep for Narcissus," they said, "for though we always pursued him in the forest, you alone could contemplate his beauty close at hand." "But was Narcissus beautiful?" the lake asked. "Who better than you to know that?" the goddesses said in wonder. "After all, it was by your banks that he knelt each day to contemplate himself." The lake was silent for some time. Finally, it said, "I weep for Narcissus, but I never noticed that Narcissus was beautiful. I weep because, each time he knelt beside my banks, I could see, in the depths of his eyes, my own beauty reflected." What a lovely story, the alchemist thought. Yeah, when I first read the book, I mean, there's a really crazy synchronicity around that, which I'd love to tell that story in another talk maybe. But when I first read that book, there was synchronistic prompting, like weird coincidences that got me to read it. And then as soon as I read that prologue, I got goosebumps, like big major goosebumps. And then as I continued to read the book, which I read in one sitting, I must have got goosebumps like 24 times probably throughout the whole book, which I've never had that happen with any piece of media ever. I can't even think of another occasion that I've ever had goosebumps so much in my life.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. That's awesome. Yeah, I've heard that before. Like that's the actual story, right? With the extra section of the lake looking into the
That's from
Narcissus
The
eyes.
Alchemist, yeah.
So that's not part of the original tale?
No,
Oh,
that's
okay.
not part of the original Greek myth, no.
Okay, that's the version I've heard. That's
Really?
funny. Yeah.
That's astonishing. The original Greek myth involves a nymph called Echo who ends up getting cursed by a goddess. Yeah, she gets cursed by a goddess, and then she finds Narcissus, but because she can't communicate, it ends up going poorly, and he's very self-absorbed. But yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Something that came up for me as you're reading, because obviously the ending is kind of like the self-absorption going the other way as well, sort of, in
Like
terms
the
of like,
world is self-absorbed in a way, yeah.
yeah. But the without knowing that ending, there's a hint of like, oh, the lake is just a reflection. The lake doesn't see Narcissus. It just reflects Narcissus or something like that. And that makes you think kind of the opposite of the narcissist, who's kind of like the chameleon or the you often call them people pleasers because they don't have too much of a sense of self at all, which is sort of an equal and opposite, I guess, like a different type, I guess I call it. In the Enneagram, the 9 and the 2 are the two types that match that kind of description. They have their different ways of achieving it, but the
Yeah.
9 is kind of like a chameleon, doesn't have a strong sense of self, doesn't have a strong ego, or their ego behavior is all about maintaining safety, which usually means avoiding conflict, which means being easy to get along with, and that means just being amenable and malleable to others and what they enjoy, and joining in with that. I think it's interesting as well because a lot of, I think, even in the kind of new age and Eastern culture, it's all about, like, loosen the ego, don't be so egotistic. And it's not very often that you hear people say, like, actually you need a stronger ego, like actually you need to develop your sense of self in your ego. It feels like almost like a hidden version of the hero's journey of sorts, or like an unspoken version because of it.
Yeah. I
The,
mean, sorry,
I
continue.
was going to say, just the problems of the world seem to come from egomaniacs as opposed to
Yeah. I think self-image is the tricky thing, and ego is one of those words that has a whole bunch of different meanings, Um, like one thing ego can mean is like excessive self-regard, you know what I mean? But then another way of thinking of ego is just that part of your mind that pictures yourself to yourself,
Mm,
which that's what I would generally prefer to think of it. And in that respect, it makes sense that you want to have a strong ego. Also, another way of thinking about ego is self-esteem, right? So
mm,
and self-esteem isn't just like if you think positively of yourself. Part of how I think something people don't appreciate about self-esteem is like a resource that you can draw on to bolster resilience in
mm.
situations where you're being tested. So self-esteem in that respect, a strong ego, which is something that usually your parents try to create in you, some sense of unity, structure, strength in your ego to help you regulate. The point of the ego is ultimately to help you to regulate your behavior and your emotions and stuff,
Mm.
because in order to be socialized you need to be capable of controlling yourself, so you need to
Right.
know what you're going to be like, right? And that's the idea of the ego. So strengthening that part of yourself that pictures you and can subordinate some parts of you to other parts of you, to me makes a whole lot of sense. I think the important thing to understand, and I think the reason for this emphasis against the ego is not the top dog, right? The ego is like an emissary of your larger self,
Mm.
right? So the self with a capital S. And the ego does not have everything right. The ego is not the ego gives the sense of having all the answers, but it is an intermediary player.
Yeah, like a mediator, or kind of like
Yes,
it sort of it doesn't, or it kind of filters and decides what's allowed through, and but at the same time it doesn't, like it. Obviously, Freud's model, he has the superego and the
mm,
id, and the ego is kind of like the mediator between those two things. The Jungian model is the persona and the
yeah.
shadow and the
No,
self.
I think both of those models reasonably apply. But to me, the Jungian model is a more complete
Mm.
understanding because it
Nuanced, maybe.
includes the notion of a self, the say your whole mind. That ultimately, where the ego is regulatory of the conscious mind, there's an aspect, an organizing aspect to your whole mind that is regulatory of the ego.
Mm. Yep. And in some sense, you can think of the what we're calling the self-healing nature of the psyche doesn't make sense too much without something
Exactly,
like
exactly.
a self or something aspirational to move
Exactly,
towards.
because it's that thing, the self, and people know. The older you get, the more sure you are that there is something like this. Because people have these experiences of being like, I don't know what to do. I'm lost. I'm just gonna do what I'm just gonna chill for now. I'm just gonna keep doing what I'm doing or whatever. I'm just gonna make decisions according to what makes sense now because I can't tell what's going on overall. And then retrospectively, they'll be like, "Oh, look at that! I was going in the right direction all along." It's almost like I knew, It's
Mm-hmm.
almost like some part of me knew. Like, although consciously I couldn't grasp the whole picture, some
Mm.
part of me was tracking the whole picture. You know?
Yeah, yeah. And there's some kind of development of trust in that process as well, I think, that comes when you start practicing things like synchronicity and this,
Yes.
and sort of aligning yourself more purposefully and intentionally towards this sort of self-healing nature of things.
Hmm.
Because like you said, it sort of,
Yeah.
it almost, like, again, I kind of get the ick when I think about people saying like, oh, the universe did this for me, and I manifested this or whatever. And again, it feels like there's a grain of truth in that, but it's not. It's usually too simple of a story being told around
Yeah. Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
would say is
I'm also
happening.
wary of the conceptual baggage there. Like
Mm.
I think a lot of people who talk about synchronicity aren't. Synchronicity is another area like conspiratorial thinking that is almost synonymous with sloppy thinking.
Mm.
Like a lot of the people who are proponents of synchronicity are people who are not exercising any epistemological rigor or care because they don't think that that matters, or they think their audience doesn't think that matters, and many of their
Yeah.
audience doesn't care about that in reality.
Yeah, I think it's maybe pertinent to bring up Jung's typing system in this sense, because he sort of designed his typing system around the receiving and responding to information that fits nicely in with synchronicity. So, like,
Yeah.
if we receive information and we respond in a kind of emotional, reactive way, like yes, go towards, or no, move away, then we might lose sight of a kind of understanding embedded in that information. And like any typing system, I'd say the ideal is to find yourself, and then find yourself not from one type but from the whole system, in the whole system.
Yeah.
And similarly
To
with,
learn to see yourself from all those different perspectives.
yeah, exactly, and where you feel the most tentative to
Oh
step.
yeah.
I think in terms of the Jung system, at least in terms of like receiving information, it's like, well, actually, I want to receive information from my senses, and I want to receive information from my intuition, and I want to process that information both in terms of getting data from how it feels, like if it's like, oh, I'm scared of this, then, and then also information from my thinking about that thing, and symbolism and whatnot, and all these data points come together into kind of more nuanced understanding of any synchronistic event or any kind of information hitting my system.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I just wanted to quickly put a pin in the synchronicity thing because I wanted to just open up the thing. You're talking about typology. I really like the way you were just thinking about it. I think should be emphasized, which is
Mm.
sort of like as something. So I think the usual way of relating to a typology is that we all are boxed into one of the boxes. You just are in one of the
Yeah,
boxes, and that's where you are, and that's the way it is. So, and that's like, yeah, there's a boxed in quality to that, which is like you can't move, there's no motion, there's no growth, you can't become more
yeah.
than that. This is
It
like
becomes an identity of sorts. It's like, oh,
exactly.
I'm just this, so therefore, anytime I do something that is not like that type's bad behavior,
Well,
I'm justified in doing it because that's
exactly.
me.
I wanted to touch on that. I wanted to say like it becomes a way of of rationalizing that you can't help certain
Yeah,
behaviors,
yeah,
which I really don't like. But the way that you articulated it was like it opens up different ways of relating to yourself, relating to other people, different perspectives of looking at the world through, and of looking at yourself through, which I really like. And in general, I think typologies, it's one of those subjects that gets really misunderstood and maligned, I think, by intellectual culture. I would relate to a typology as like a screwdriver or a hammer or something I would put in a toolbox.
mm,
If it's useful for making sense of things, then use it, and if it's not, put it down.
yeah,
It's that simple. It doesn't have to be. What's this? The talk of like. To be fair, I really like a an empirically validated model of personality like the Big Five. I think that's in a way that's a more useful tool in a
mm,
way. But I think that a typology has uses that are different and very valuable. And having access to multiple typologies, I think, and being able to project yourself into different perspectives within a typology other than the one, say, that you traditionally identify with,
mm.
I think is extremely useful for prototyping interactions with other ways of thinking.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like you don't have to necessarily take on the literalness of a typology system, but you can see new information, new data, or new ways of possibly exploring your own experience through the typology system.
Yeah.
Like there's even one typology system that I explored a little bit is human design, which is sort of a mixture of the I Ching and astrology, and it has it's very complicated.
Yeah, I think Eddie's actually talked a little bit about that to me.
Right, yeah, and it has these gates and things are open and closed and these sensors and whatnot. And yeah, even though I don't identify, I'm kind of a projector in the terminology of human design. There's something about it, the description of a projector that I hadn't thought of before, like that's not in any other typing system, which is because apparently projectors have their centers are quite open, like they're not defined as the terminology in the system. That means that I can feel other people's senses, and that my default mode of perception and energy is kind of within another. That fits nicely with the kind of type 9 and the someone who listens intently and doesn't have much of a sense of self. It's like, oh, I'm deriving my sense of self from someone else, and then in order to do that, I'm kind of feeling them out in some sense. But it's also just kind of like, oh, well, how do I play with that as a reality? Like, how do I try that on? And that was just unique to that model. So yeah, like you're saying, there's so many different. Well, there's not heaps and heaps, but there's quite a few different typology systems, and I'd encourage anyone just to like explore them and be like, oh, what does that mean for me? Like, how is it true? How is it not true?
Well, yeah, and I think more generally, I would encourage an attitude towards things like typing systems and astrology and the tarot and synchronicity, stuff like that, as like an archaeological type of attitude, right? Like this is an artifact and we don't presume to know what it means because we lack so much information about it. That is what, especially something like astrology, is exactly like a fossilized artifact dug up from the ground. We don't understand it. We cannot relate to the minds of the people who made it. So it's easy to caricature it, and that's what most people do, is they caricature it. And so there's a sense of a lack of intellectual credibility. But I think you can suspend that easily by relating to it as an artifact of the past and looking at it as something fascinating to be understood, not as something to project closure onto, as, oh, that this is primitive nonsense. You know what I mean? This is just, yeah.
Yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with astrology. Like it gives me the ick when I hear people kind of saying, "Oh, watch out for this week.
Yeah.
It's retrograde."
Well, this
whatever.
is the thing, is when you get something like an artifact from the past like that, that doesn't have a clearly defined rationale, people can, in a sense, make up whatever they like. Like there is no authority to say, no, that's wrong. This is what it really means. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
and just because I don't know, it's interesting. Obviously, the people who are going to be listening to someone talking about an astrological event and the particular effects of that event on a particular day or week, those people are going to be invested in that being true in some sense, and they're probably going to be like, oh yeah, if I feel it, this is happening in my world or whatever. So there's some level of kind of like, oh, these people are all saying that it's true, like, and they're feeling it, and it must be true, or something, or like having a relationship to it that's risk, like a group think almost.
well, I think that's why I feel like it's such a good parallel with typologies, psychological typologies, because for me, the value, and I think this is, tarot is a really good example of this. Tarot is not about telling the future. Tarot is about illuminating what's going on now by drawing to your attention connections that you hadn't noticed. And the connections are effectively coincidental, right? The cards don't have any mechanical relationship with what's going on in your life. The cards fall as they do, and as you look at them, you see yourself in them like a mirror. It's like, and it's that's the utility of them. It's not that they're telling the future, it's that you remember how psychological dynamics work. Maybe you've been here before, you know what I mean? And you're not self-remembering, you're not awake, and so tarot cards, astrology, all of these things, they're ways of helping us to remember, because I think ancient humans knew the biggest issue humans have ever had to face is forgetfulness, and writing things down did not help. If anything, it complexified the problem, because now we have a way of remembering that is non-committal, that doesn't require us to know, that doesn't require us to understand. And so we can have something like astrology, which is like we know what people wrote about it, we know what people quote unquote thought, but we actually don't know what they thought. We cannot even imagine what it was like to inhabit that cognitive prejudice, that way of relating to the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like what you said there about like using the tarot in that way, and that's something that I've more recently through my psychotherapy training have come to use it in that way. Like I if I feel like the person's going to be open to this, and I'm like, oh, I would like a tarot reading, not for the sake of divination, but for the sake
Yeah,
of almost like a Rorschach, and thinking
yeah,
like
no,
this is going to
exactly.
be a
And to
way
be
in.
clear, that's not my idea. Actually, these are interpretations of tarot and astrology I get from a psychologist called Liz Green. She
Mm-hmm.
wrote a great book on these subjects. So I would recommend that to anyone who's interested in an intellectually sober treatment of the subjects. And in
Mm.
her introductions, she does an excellent job of clearing up the kind of woo confusions and making her approach psychologically oriented. And the way that I got onto that book was that when I was working with Mystic, who is the guy who taught me all about synchronicity, he recommended that this book to me, not the tarot one. I ended up finding that one, but Astrology for Lovers by Liz Green is the original book I read on astrology, and it was fascinating. It was really fascinating, and I enjoyed the tarot book even more. The tarot book I felt was the tarot was much more organized conceptually than astrology is, I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, my first foray into having a new, because my mum had a tarot deck on the bookshelf again when I was a kid, but never really told me what it was. She actually bought me a kind of Lord of the Rings tarot set. There was also a game that I played the game heaps, but I'd never learned the tarot out of it. Um, but as an adult, I started getting really interested in Robert Anton Wilson, and specifically his or it's actually Timothy Leary's 8-circuit brain model, but Robert Anton Wilson did his own treatise of it, and then Antero Ali is kind of another person who did a treatise on it, and Antero Ali did a great book called Angel Tech, which is kind of like the recognition of the left and right hemispheres of like the angel in us and the technician in us, kind of thing.
Cool.
And yeah, a lot of influences from Gurdjieff and lots of good thinkers. But anyway, one of the chapters in the book was designing your own tarot, and all about coming, like the purpose of it is to find the kind of archetypal meaning in the card, and then to bring your own flavor to it and make it your own.
Yes. Yeah.
So and I think that's a really cool process, because it's almost like the tarot does embody some, I guess, I want to say archetypal landscape, but in a sense, it's like the elements are there, and then the major arcana are kind of like this three cycles of 7, and within it is embedded these different archetypes of sorts, these different qualities of what it means to be a human being. And again, you can kind of use it. One way I've used it before is like going through each of the cards, and like each week kind of being like, oh, what is the quality of this card? How does it show up in my life? How can I kind of put it on more if I'm kind of scared of it? Or how can I, be aware of it, but I'm acting it out too much or whatever.
Almost like a meditative support in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Just a focus for the kind of quality that I'm wanting to explore.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And I also really like the idea of making your own tarot. It reminds me of, in case anyone's wondering, the beautiful artwork that I wear in all our interviews and stuff. It's by a guy called Mr. Crystalface. You can find him online, but actually some of his artwork is him developing slowly his own tarot deck. Like the magician one that I love. It's got to be my favorite piece by him. This actually is the full. This is the full. His depiction of the fall. You can't.
Cool.
I'd have to get up. You wouldn't be able to see it properly, but you can find it on his website. Another beautiful one. He's got one for the self as well. Really cool as well. But yeah, the magician one is so, like, I use it a lot as a meditative support because I've got a big banner of it. So I'll just sit there and get lost in the details and think about the symbolism and what it's beautiful and very evocative. And so, but that'll probably take him, I think, 5 years or something to get through the whole deck because his artwork is so intricate. Interestingly, though, I talked to him about it, and he said that like initially the project was prompted because there was a guy who wanted to collaborate with him, and he basically said that the guy was super unreliable and he's not collaborating with him anymore, and the guy was going to do the text for the cards.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, I mean, I haven't said anything to him about it yet, but in the back of my mind, I thought, dude, I could do something like that. That would be really cool. I'd love to contribute to that project, and I also think I could do a really good job of that. And yeah, it just reminded me of that because you're talking about creating your own tarot, and I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't be capable of actually creating the artwork, but I could certainly, work quite hard on trying to synthesize my understanding of the different archetypes and the different cycles and stuff
Yeah.
like that
Yeah,
into
it
a
would
written
be a
script.
great project.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really cool. Like, I had a similar project where I was trying to write a piece of music for each of a tarot as well, but that didn't get very far.
That sounds really cool.
I only did the full.
It actually reminds me of I think this is the right guy, Bruno Giordano.
Hmm.
I think it's him.
The
So
Heretic.
it was like a fuck, what was it called? He had an idea. It was like a memory palace or something, and
Hmm.
it was like you would have 7 tiers and 7 columns and 7 rows and artifacts. I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but basically his idea was like you would look out and there would be these different qualities to each of the exhibits where they would have like, different media representations and text and potentially music and stuff, but where you could look out and have look out upon the entire sum of human knowledge basically was his
Hmm.
idea. And like look out at that at all these symbolic things, and if you wanted to go into the details you get closer, you know what I mean, you go up to it. But his thought was that you could use this memory theater, memory palace thing, I can't even remember exactly what he called it, but it's something like that,
Yeah,
to
interesting.
like as a meditative focal point to kind of like for a mystic, wow, this is such a
Hmm.
fascinating idea, man,
Yeah, yeah, really cool. Like the idea of a memory palace has always fascinated me from watching like Sherlock. Um, he's depicted as having one, but also the imagery as well. I think is really important. Like to create a solid mnemonic in your head of
Yeah,
something. I've had this image of like being inside a sphere, and each there's kind of like squares. Each the sphere is made up of like hundreds of little squares, and each of those squares is kind of like a piece of information or a piece of knowledge of some kind, and they're seemingly disparate quite often, but actually they're connected in this overall
yeah, yeah,
sphere.
yeah, definitely.
I haven't worked with it too much, but it's kind of a similar thing, like trying to find the information that I need to access. And yeah, I definitely and obviously don't use it very often. Otherwise, I'd remember these names of things.
Yeah,
Actually,
no.
one of the books I was trying to remember earlier was Roberto Assagioli's Psychosynthesis, about the nature of psychosis and the self.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe we could circle back around a little bit to psychosis and the relationship between that and spiritual or mystical experiences, and the connection between that and synchronicity, because there's a great quote, I think we brought it up before we started recording, right, which is the psychotic drowns in the same waters that the mystic swims in.
Was it the other way around?
I
I
don't
think
know. It
you
might be the
corrected
other way
me
around.
before.
I felt that moment where I was like, "Oh no, now I'm not sure what way it is."
Yeah. Maybe it doesn't matter. It's
It doesn't.
tautological.
It doesn't really matter, no. Anyway, the
Yeah.
sentiment is what's important, which I definitely think that there's something. Not only I think it's a quote from Jung, and not only is there something super valid and profound in that, but it's actually a distillation of his personal experience. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Because obviously Jung is famous for being a psychiatrist, famous for being one of the founders of psychology. Jung's way of thinking about psychology is personally my favorite. But the extraordinary thing about him as a figure, in the history of psychology, is that he experimented on himself with his method and
Mm.
recorded all his observations, and effectively went half crazy for a while he tried to, he induced what is got to be close to a latent psychosis, and then tried to work his way through it,
Mm.
and successfully did it, and ended up becoming, from his own accounts, much more of a person through that experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yeah, there's just something really fascinating, I think, about the idea of active. He called it active imagination, obviously, like actively engaging with and um, participating in the fantasy that is almost like you're having the fantasy whether you will admit to it or not. You know what
Mm.
I mean? And
Yeah.
just trying to bring light to that, and trying to own that. That to me is always really fascinating. And the line, I guess, between that and psychosis and spiritual
Mm.
emergence is really hard, I think, to define. And that's why at the beginning, when you kind of said, recognizing the difference, part of the question I want to ask is, how do you recognize the difference? And you said, the archetypal images, which that seems like a good answer. But like, as it kind of seemed like when I kind of queried, well, then what would be those other cases, right? You're like, well, the kind of similar kind of thing with the fracturing and the leaking through of unconscious contents, which makes sense. But I guess part of my puzzlement is that it seems to me that the self-healing nature of the psyche is archetypal in nature. So I have difficulty imagining a case of psychosis that wouldn't have archetypal qualities.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right there. And like if we are positing the kind of self-healing nature of the psyche in this sense of like, when it's psychosis or spiritual emergency, it's the unbidden kind of thrust upon us version of the healing.
Yeah.
But there's some version of it where we're actually leaning in, and things become kind of more synchronistic of sorts when that leaning in is happening. And,
Okay, okay.
and I
So
think there's
maybe whether we're fighting it or not is
right.
maybe the big
And
difference.
partly we're fighting it or not, depending on how other people are helping us
Yeah,
frame
no, I
it
think
and,
that's
and
really, I
responding
just
to it.
got a bit of goosebumps there. I think that's really, I want to write that down.
Mm. Yeah, there's definitely a feeling of like the leaning in is what the mystic is doing, right? Like the
For sure, yeah, no.
intentional
Yeah.
uncovering of like, oh, what is this world behind the world?
I feel like that is really worth remembering, because that to me seems like a very important insight, that you know the thought that, like, because I think we opened the discussion kind of talking a little bit about the pathologizing attitude of psychology and
Mm.
psychiatry, and how that can make it worse, and to recognize that if the pivotal thing between, say, a progressive psychosis and a regressive psychosis is whether we're fighting it or not, then that places the onus directly on the physician's attitude. Do you know what I mean? Because he or she is the only person who will be able to intervene in that.
Yeah, but I guess there's another issue of like, what is this? Like, if let's say I've got a client who's having psychotic symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, well, what is this person's support network? Like, if I guide them further in this episode, are they going to be able to leave in 15 minutes and make it home, or are they going to, there's a lot to consider in terms
Yes.
of, actually making that
Well, and
decision.
I think that's part of the problem with psychology as a commercial thing, right? Is that you have to be able to support yourself, and so there's constraints. I've always felt this is part of the problem with psychology, is that, like, in my own experience, most of the healing I do is the kind of thing that you couldn't commodify, and that requires substantial investments outside of what reasonably the person can repay you for. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like, it seems like, in a way, healing and the commodifying instinct run, they're directly at loggerheads in some way.
Yeah. And there's, when I'm always tempted in my therapy sessions to do kind of as much psychoeducation as possible. It's like, I want to give this person the tools to not need me anymore, in
Well,
essence, which,
yes,
isn't a
exactly,
very
that's a good
good
idea.
strategy for making money, but it's for me,
No, that's a
yeah, that's
great
kind of
idea
why I
though
want to
for
do it.
helping people to heal themselves. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that.
exactly. It's like how the we will go through processes, and there will be kind of explicit healing journeys or whatnot in sessions, but ideally those processes are kind of made explicit in a way where they can then take it
Yeah,
home and continue with the
yeah. Well, that's kind
resources.
of what I mean. Is because when I get into that situation, I don't have another client soon, right? I don't have because it's
Mm,
not commercialized because it's not. Uh like if I get into that situation, it's like, okay, like this is the priority. Everything else I've got to do goes on hold until you're good to leave this interaction and you'll be okay. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah.
if that means like 3 or 4 hours, that's what that means. You know what I mean?
Mm. I try
Yeah.
not to run over more than half an hour if I can help it.
No,
But
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. No, but and that makes sense. But I just mean like if someone is not in a state to stop, you know what I mean? Like it's not resolved. You've
yeah,
opened it up because they needed it opened up. It's like a surgery, you know what I mean? It's like you got to finish. You can't just stop because the bell rang. You know what I mean?
yeah,
You
yeah,
got to
exactly.
finish.
Yeah, yeah. There's a sense of like requiring in a surgery requires like precision and gentleness, and um, yeah, I feel it's the same with a psychic surgery of sorts. Like
Yeah.
you gotta.
No. Yeah. Exactly. And I think
Um,
that's a really good way of thinking about it. Is that what you are trying to do is the minimally invasive intervention
mm,
to help them begin to heal. You know what I mean?
right. It's
Yeah.
interesting as well, like talking about kind of acts of imagination and these sort of it feels like Jung's uh, tools that he discovered were very helpful for him because he had a kind of mind that was helpful for. Not everybody has a good capacity for imagining things.
Yes, I think especially say like um encouraging or facilitating the manifestation of unconscious contents, you got to have a certain kind of temperament to be capable of withstanding that and not cracking under the pressure, say. Uh, and so, and I think, it reminds me of, I can't remember who it is, but it's the writings of some mystic, Christian mystic, I think, who basically puts at the beginning of one of his books, if you are not a spiritual self surmounter, leave my books alone.
Mm,
Focus on whatever nonsense you care about, but do not dabble with this unless you are the type of person who is cut out for it. You know what I mean?
mm, mm. Yeah, I think EMDR is sort of this modern empirical based uh, working therapy
What's
that
that one
is
again?
um, eye movement uh,
Yeah,
directional
yeah, yeah.
rehabilitation. I can't remember
Mhm.
exactly the acronym, but it's kind of well, I think different practitioners probably do it differently. But some of my experiences of EMDR is resourcing, finding resources that will help you in the journey ahead, and subsequent sessions are kind of deepening the connection with those resources, and they're sort of available after the sessions as well. So kind of like, oh, imagine a place where you felt like the most comfortable and safe, and imagine a figure that represents maybe something that you need right now, like power or insight or whatever that is. And then going into the work of like whatever you're bringing, where's that leading to? And for me, because I am a very visual person, it always becomes like quite a visual storytelling moment. And quite often it is very much like active imagination for me. It's almost like, oh, I'm seeing this is happening. Oh, this is
Yeah.
how this character is responding. And I kind of feel like doing this in the vision, and then I just play it out and
Yeah,
connect
yeah.
with.
I think that there's potentially more secure or safer ways of framing the engagement with active imagination. I think Jung went into it without any guardrails because,
Ways of experimenting.
well, he's experimenting, and also I think he felt he had the stuff in him. He had that
Mm-hmm.
dog in him. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
There's also a sense as well that we can access our unconscious content through like our body, for example, like um, the focusing techniques, as I like to frame it under, is that every piece of content has multiple points of in our
yeah,
experience, like this the kind of symbolic domain, the story domain, the sensory domain, and the emotional domain,
well,
and
yeah,
they're all arising at the same time, but we have preferences of how we like to
Yeah.
feel it or not. So there is a kind of active imagination of sorts available to people who don't have a good imagination, but it's not active imagination anymore. It's maybe like working with a sensation and relating to that sensation, or a kind of sensation plus emotion plus story or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, like my version of active imagination is something like it's like a fusion between fiction and autobiographical storytelling. You know, so
Mm.
it's not visual. You know, it's narrative basically. It's
Yeah.
made of words. I'm making a world of words, and then I'm trying to live in that in a
Mm.
way. You
Yeah,
know.
yeah, cool.
Oh, what was I going to say? God damn it.
Well, the interesting thing is that these faculties that we have in our experience, they're parts of our experience, are all, if they're all connected and they're kind of, we can explore the healing, the self-healing nature of the psyche is possible through, all
Oh,
these different domains of our experience. Thinking like, what does that tell us about the psyche? Like, is it just something in a head, or is it actually connected throughout our whole
yeah.
system?
Well, I think I definitely think the psyche is not something localized in our head. I think head. I think that octopuses are a really good, or octopi rather, are a good model. We know octopi have distributed consciousness throughout their bodies. Their tentacles can partially think for themselves.
Mm.
The tentacle can make decisions without that electrical information traveling back to the main brain because they're neuronal cells. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, we know that neuronal cells are distributed throughout the human body. We know that the heart has neurons in it, quite a chunk of them. And we also know that when people get organ transplants, it changes their personality. We have lots of empirical evidence that
Mm.
organ transplants carry some semblance of the person who the organ belonged to. Which is very strange, you know, but not that strange if you consider that you are your whole body. You know, it's not just
Yeah.
we very much because the brain is so important. You know, we identify very much with this thing up here, and there's a good reason for that because most of what me is, as far as my personality, is processing up here. You know what I mean?
Right.
But all of that, like in a broader sense, in a more holistic sense, me is a brain body complex, and the brain and the body are intermeshed, not just in a linear top down kind of chunk. You know,
Mm.
it's like the brain and body are interwoven. That's what like my neural what would you call it? Sorry, the nerves. My nervous system is literally just like the appendage part of my brain. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. And if you look at pictures where they've taken the whole nervous system out of the body, it kind of still looks like a body. Like it's
Yeah,
just fully just goes in every single point of the body
exactly. Yeah.
anyway. So we are just kind of a distributed information system.
Yep, and equally, you can think of your spine. Your spine is like a very important piece of hardware, you know, for
Mm.
you. Yeah, I think your spine and your brain make up probably 75% of what you are, but your body is a very important part of that, as partly because, especially the brain, is a secondary phenomenon. You know, like you have you have sophisticated bodies way before you have sophisticated brains. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, an accident that we ended up with a very sophisticated brain.
Yeah, there's also a sense that we can do incredible things physically without much of our brain turned on. I mean, there's obviously always brain functioning, but like we can
Yeah,
sleepwalk and make a sandwich
yeah,
and
yeah. I
do.
mean, you can take most of what we use, what we modern humans use. You can take most of that brain out, and your motor functions and your normal autonomic functions are intact, and you'll be able to satisfy your thirst and so on. You know, you're like the reptilian part of your brain will still be online and
Mm-hmm.
operative.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? There's just like this small layer of extra stuff that seems to make all the difference.
Yeah, that's definitely. I think it's really important. I think to try to uh, disrupt the intuitive assumption that consciousness is localized primarily in the head. I even think it's plausible that consciousness extends out beyond the body, like that there's some
Mm.
kind of field of consciousness that goes like a meter or so. or maybe less, maybe more. I don't know. That certainly seems
Yeah,
possible for
or
me.
maybe it's something that you can only really access through like very specific training of some kind. And the
Mhm.
reason why it's so hard to empirically verify various different, non-standard modalities of experience is precisely because not many people are even attempting to practice those things. And yeah, so it's like
Yeah,
obviously with empirical evidence, you need more than one point of data to verify it. So it's a hard
yeah,
thing to
yeah.
capture.
I mean, the consciousness extending out from your body thing, that is a supposition that I find plausible for a couple of reasons. So one thing is, the scarab example. I think it makes intuitive sense to me that if people are focusing on something as meaningful, and you imagine that there's this field that extends, then if there's something around that is like that thing that we're really focusing on, that thing could feel drawn to, called to. You know what I mean? That seems
Mm.
plausible, like without giving a detailed description of the
Yeah,
mechanics or
let's
whatever.
avoid the detailed
Yeah,
metaphysical
yeah,
assumptions needed to make any of this real.
definitely, definitely. But
That
another thing
conversation soon,
is,
though.
similarly with synchronicity, is you know, a lot of people ask how it works. There's this question about, is it really just in your head? Is it just in
Mm.
your head? And I think one way I like to think about it that is helped a lot along by this notion that maybe consciousness extends out is, obviously we like this. When we like say that the world is a certain way, represented as being a certain way, there's a way in which you can think of that as we're like looking out at the world and we're painting over the top of it how we think it is, and I think that's really is what's happening on some level. Um, it's not just a metaphor; that almost is
Yeah,
what
yeah.
we do.
Like
But
we only see the small sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. Doesn't mean
yeah,
the rest of it's not always there. It's just that's what we actually are
yeah.
seeing.
Yeah, yeah. And so part of me thinks, okay, so if we're painting it over the world, and then that the us thing actually is also touching some of that world, then my thought is maybe there's an interference pattern, like when our way of representing things isn't how they really are, right? There's an interference pattern, and then that manifests as
Mm.
synchronicity. That's basically part of how one toy model, say, that I sometimes think about when I'm thinking, how could this work?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I want to have a conversation more specifically around this stuff with you another time. So maybe we
Yeah,
not get
definitely,
into the
definitely.
gritty details of
Yeah,
that.
I mean,
How,
I definitely think there is a great conversation to be had around like techniques and ideas and concepts that are useful for people who want to learn to stalk synchronicity.
mm,
But I mean, I think just in connection to what we were saying, obviously the theme of the conversation today is kind of the self healing nature of the psyche, and I think when we were talking about active imagination, I a part of a question came up in my mind, which is like, okay, it does seem like you have to be made of a certain kind of stuff to actively, proactively want to dabble, and to be safe to do that. You know what I mean?
mm,
So what about for those other people, right? So what about for people who aren't made of that stuff or aren't inclined that way? And I think this is where you get into synchronicity, because proactively engaging with it, I think synchronicity becomes more common, but in a way becomes less important, because you know you are more open in general to that way of relating to the world, and so you don't need to be corrected as much, I suppose, which is how I think of synchronicity, as a way of
yeah,
correcting when we close down the world. But when someone's passive, when they don't proactively engage in it, then the only way for that self healing function to triumph over the ego is for synchronicity, is for something that is meaningful in a way that transcends your ego framework for making sense of the world. And in this,
mm,
I really love the scarab example, because part of how Jung relates the scarab example was this woman had been to two doctors before him and neither of them could help her. And he diagnoses her problem as having a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccably geometrical view of reality.
mm,
And he says he tried to sweeten her with a somewhat more human understanding, right? Which is, I take that to mean, not, you can't fit the world in your head, honey. We're all tiny little insignificant creatures. Like, you got to
Mm.
have some humility. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
you got to acknowledge that there are things that you can't predict in advance. The world is more complex than you can imagine.
Mm.
And he said that that didn't work. He wasn't able to convince her. And so he had to resign himself to waiting for something to happen. Right. And the way he relates it is that when this scarab from her dream came in through the window, he says this broke the ice of her intellectual resistance, and the treatment could now begin to move. The transformation
Mm.
could now begin to move. And he says that the actual scarab beetle obviously is a symbol of transformation. But the thing I find so intriguing and illuminating about that is that basically what he's saying is, when the scarab came in through the window from her dream, she was confronted with something she could not explain. And being confronted with something she could not explain, she had to admit that maybe she didn't have all the answers. And
Mm.
having admitted that, she opened herself up to get better.
Cool. Yeah, it became a sort of Zen koan of sorts in the
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Yeah. And that, I think, is, that's, I think, the inroad for normal people with synchronicity. Most people, there's people who are going to be listening to this who are going to be like, synchronicity sounds cool and all, but I've just never experienced something like that.
Mm.
And I would respond, you probably have. You probably just don't recognize that that's what it was. You probably do have experiences of situations you've been in where they've resolved positively in your favor, in favor of your healing or growth, in a way that's got these weird qualities that you just kind of, you're not sure about, you know what I mean? And a lot of us cope with that just by saying, well, if I can't make sense of it, I'll just mark it as irrelevant. And a crazy thing happens if you mark something as irrelevant, which is you forget about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you have to purposefully turn towards it and keep trying it on before making your decision, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not going to work for you if you are too skeptical and therefore forget about it. Like, yeah, there has to be some level of
Yes.
persistence.
Openness and attention amplifies synchronistic phenomena. That is
Yeah.
one of the principal rules for anyone getting into it. And I mean, if you're one of those people who has never had an experience like that, has never had a mystical experience, never had a peak experience, and of course, this recommendation comes with caveats. Like, obviously, you want to make sure that, first of all, you're safe to take this kind of thing, and setting and stuff. But psychedelics is a really great way of opening the door to the kind of transformative healing journey that is detached from your rational working through, and also an openness to the difference and the complexity of the world from what you imagine. I think most people, when they have their first psychedelic experience, there's this moment of shock and a deep appreciative wonder, actually, that, oh, my usual ways of making sense of the world aren't working. And now that I'm thinking about it from here, they don't seem so obvious. Maybe they're not right. There's this crazy radical openness where, when your prior structures aren't working, you see that, oh, maybe, and this echoes the same thing that I was talking about in terms of the scarab, right? You're confronted with something that proves to you that your prior understanding was inadequate. Is that reality is more complex than you can imagine. There's that Shakespeare quote. And I think that this is a really it's an important inroad, I think, for people who want to learn more about this and want to potentially explore synchronicity for the healing effects. Is psychedelics are a medicine, and that is how they've been used in shamanic culture for thousands of years. And if you use them correctly, you can use them in a medicinal way to heal yourself, to start yourself on a journey of transformation and growth. And a psychedelic experience and a mystical experience, there's a certain parallel there. There's a certain phenomenological similarity that, once you've had the psychedelic experience, then you have something to relate it to, which makes it easier to avoid saying, well, I have nothing to make sense of this with, so I'm just going to mark it as irrelevant. After a psychedelic experience, you can go, okay, I mean, this is odd, but I've experienced odder things, though.
Yeah, there's something there as well about, like, doing it in an intentional way and being able to sit with the experience and kind of keep checking in, like, oh, what's this is interesting, and kind of having that
Yes,
almost scientific experimental mindset towards it. There's a certain point where that becomes really difficult, especially if you take enough to have kind of the
yes,
ego death experience, and that can actually bring up a lot for
precisely.
people.
And if you were trying to take that approach, like an experimental approach, which I would absolutely recommend, and that's why I say setting is so important.
Mm.
But if you wanted to do something like ego death, which definitely you should not try on your first time, I would recommend something like a recorder, like to record yourself, to videotape yourself, because I think there is a lot of valuable information in that, and your memory totally stops functioning properly. Like you'll be missing chunks, and it won't make sense, and
Yeah,
it'll be
there's
hard
also,
to put back together.
I feel as well, there's an integration, like after the experience integration as well, that there's a risk, right? Like anyone who's coming like to an experience like a psychedelic experience with the mindset of like, oh well, it's all just chemicals in the brain, or it's a kind of reductive
Yeah,
way of basically missing out on all the gifts of the experience. Like even if that were true, even if it were just chemicals in the brain, whatever that even means, there's so much more there than the chemical experience. Like that's kind of like saying consciousness is just,
well,
you
yeah,
know,
and I mean, I think it kind of the argument gets dismantled in the same way, which is like in the first person experience of it, right? So when you take a psychedelic, the idea that it's just chemicals in the brain just becomes so incoherent as to be
yeah.
utterly irrelevant.
But that's, I guess, why I mean the integration piece, like that after the experience. Like I
Oh
don't,
yes, yes. I think an important frame for people to remember in relation to psychedelics is it's much more likely to show you the nature and structure of your subconscious mind than it is to show you the fundamental deep nature of reality. I'm
mm,
not saying it's impossible to get glimpses into the deep nature of reality, but I'm just saying take your experience with a grain of salt. It's not necessarily what intuitively you might immediately characterize it as.
yeah, exactly. It's kind of like you have to kind of clear your mind of some of the layers of crap that you've been, might have been absorbing for a while.
Exactly. And oftentimes I think people don't really appreciate what the psychedelic experience that they had meant until a few months later. So
Yeah, or years.
if you've got a very radical interpretation and it's only been a couple of days, just chill before telling
Mm-hmm.
everyone about it, because you'll probably feel embarrassed in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, this is my proclivity, but I usually listen to like some Terence McKenna poetry, or like watch some Alex Gray imagery or something like that. Like there's
Yeah.
visionary artists that have cultivated a kind of integration in their expression, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
they're taking psychedelics a lot, and what they're
Yeah,
creating is actually,
Alan
yeah, Alan
Watts is
Watts.
good for this. Yeah.
Yeah. So what they're creating is actually the perfect kind of tool for integration experience, even if you don't
Yeah,
necessarily
it
agree
gets you
with
it
all of
gets
it.
you thinking along the right lines.
Mm,
I think another thing that people don't realize is that, and I think this is a really good place to kind of maybe start wrapping up, is I think what people don't realize is that a big part of what makes a psychedelic experience negative or positive is whether you go with the flow.
hmm
The biggest characteristic that makes a trip. So I've taken way too much before, so much that like I didn't just have ego death. Like I couldn't make sense of time. I couldn't perceive my friends. Like it felt like the environment was talking to me. Like I literally could
mm,
not pick my friends' bodies out from the environment. It's distressing to be that fucked up, actually.
yeah.
But more than anything, it was the thing that I didn't like was that I didn't have any control over my experience at all. And at a certain point, I decided, well, if I get up and walk home, then the experience has to follow me. So in a way,
hmm
like I'm in control like that. And so I found a way of going with the experience by saying, well, I'm doing something about it. I'm kind of, you know, rather than just sitting here and being like, I'd like to be sober again. You know
mm,
what I mean?
hmm
And as I started to come down, then it's a question of choices. Why did I do that? That was silly. Why did I do that? What was my decision making process? And I think that's really important, actually. That I don't know, that the willingness to learn from what you're experiencing in the trip, I would say, is the principal pivotal thing that will determine whether you enjoy it or not. Because if you don't want to learn what you're being put through, then it's going to be fighting tooth and nail for 8 hours. You do not want that. It's going to be
Yeah, it's
horrible.
painful. Or like doing it at a party where you can't drop
Yeah,
into the experience and sort of
yes,
everything feels like, the subconscious content becomes everywhere, and it's
yeah.
all too much. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you definitely want to curate set and setting, especially for an initial trip. The first one, you do
Mm.
not want to fuck with that, because psychedelics are not. It's like any medicine. It's a double-edged sword. It's a drug. Like, if you take too much or you take it incorrectly, you could hurt yourself. It is exactly like that.
Yeah, and we're not giving anyone medical advice.
Yeah,
Cool. Yeah, so super interesting stuff. I feel like we could keep going, but maybe you're
yeah,
right. We
yeah,
should we
yeah.
should wrap up.
I'd love to explore maybe in our next chat, some of the threads we didn't get to today around synchronicity and some of the stalking
Mhm.
synchronicity stuff, and especially some of the stuff you opened up with. I thought was really ripe for that. So like breath work, and I wrote some synonyms while you were talking. So like attention, mindfulness, meditation.
Mhm.
These things for me are all part and parcel of a kind of practice. So related to stalking synchronicity, so like Buddhist ideas and some Taoist practices, and
Mhm.
there's a whole bunch of stuff that are in some ways good just on a health level. Like breathwork can be good
Yeah.
for just for your actual body, your physiological health, but there's all these techniques that people do for other reasons that can be repurposed towards stalking synchronicity. So you can get multiple benefits. Like meditation is one of those things I would recommend to anyone out there to try.
Yeah.
But practicing meditation is really useful, just as a throwaway example, for synchronicity, because a big part of distinguishing the difference between a genuine sign and what you want something to be. So your tendency as a human to read into things what you'd like them to be. Um, yeah, a big difference there is how quiet you're able to make it inside yourself, and how
Yeah.
much you're able to filter out the noise or be okay with the noise and rise above it and kind of find yourself in a tranquility where you're able to listen to all the voices without being dominated by one of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you need some kind of mindfulness to even be able to stop and notice. Be like, oh wait, something's happening. Like
Exactly.
that. Otherwise, you're just caught up in it.
Yeah, and there's an immersion and there's an absorption in
Mm.
that yeah, definitely we want to try and that's what synchronicity is all about. Synchronicity is about those moments of waking up and seeing yourself and being like, oh, that's what I'm like. Oh, that's what I'm
Yeah,
doing.
a simple practice that I enjoyed early on is just when you're watching a movie or watching a show. Like if you're noticing that you're really absorbed, just try bringing your attention back into your body and just being like, oh, what's going on? Like, what am I feeling right
Yeah,
now? And then just get back
exactly.
absorbed
Yeah.
and practice that coming in and
Yeah,
out.
and in that respect, there's the concept of self remembering, which is Uspensky describes it using a watch analogy, right? You can look at your watch, or you can look inwardly
Mm.
and watch yourself. But if you try really hard when you're looking at the watch, you can also look inwardly and watch yourself, and you can kind
Mm.
of maintain this double state. And he calls this self remembering.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of lucid dreaming techniques. Kind of like, oh yeah, if
Yes.
you look at your hands and you wobble your fingers, and then you remember to do that in your dream. But if you just remember to do that in everyday life as well, there's a moment to reflect and
Yeah,
come back
and
to
to
yourself.
ground yourself, and yeah,
Mm.
definitely, yeah.
All right, cool, amazing conversation.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to the next one. It was really beautiful. I love what we explored, and
mm,
plenty more threads for next time. So
definitely. All right, until next time.
excellent. Catch you later.